The wind had a way of sneaking through the cracks in the old wooden cabin, curling around the edges of doors and windows as if testing the strength of the walls. It carried with it the scent of dry earth and hay, mixed with a faint, lingering tang of something metallic like blood or rust. The ranch sat isolated, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by an endless sprawl of fields that rippled under the moonlight. Silence dominated, broken only by the distant calls of night birds and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures. That silence was precisely what made the arrival of a figure at the edge of the property so startling. She came stumbling down the gravel path, her clothes clinging to her in patches of mud and sweat. Her hair was matted, streaked with dirt, and tangled like the underbrush she must have crawled through to get here. Each step was unsteady, as though her body had grown weary from traveling far beyond its limits. Her eyes, dark and hollowed from sleepless nights, flickered nervously with every movement. When she saw the faint glow of the cabin's windows, she quickened her pace, almost crawling across the last stretch of dirt, arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold in something inside that threatened to spill out. Her voice, when it came, was soft, almost a whisper swallowed by the wind. "I'm filthy. Inside and out," she said, the words dripping with a kind of shame that was almost physical. She spoke them to no one in particular, yet her tone carried the weight of confession, of someone who had carried her sins, or perhaps her suffering, for far too long. The words echoed in the empty night, mingling with the sound of the wind, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. She paused at the edge of the porch, staring at the heavy wooden door with a mix of hope and fear. Hope, because there might be warmth inside. Fear, because she had no idea what awaited her. The porch creaked under her weight as she stepped closer, the sound unnerving in the quiet. Her hands, trembling, reached out as if seeking an invisible anchor. The night air had stiffened her muscles, made her joints ache, and her breath came in ragged, uneven gasps. She looked like a storm-tossed ship washed up on a shore that promised shelter but held no guarantees. Inside, the cabin was dimly lit, shadows stretching long and dark across the floorboards. The giant rancher, a figure as solid and immovable as the land itself, paused in his work when he noticed movement through the window. His large hands, calloused from years of labor, tightened instinctively around the tool he was holding, but his eyes softened when they fell on her. There was something vulnerable about her, something that demanded attention even as it invoked unease. He had seen many people pass through his life, some by choice, some by circumstance, but there was a raw honesty to her appearance that struck a chord deep within him. She raised her gaze, meeting his eyes briefly through the window. There was no pretension, no attempt to charm or deceive. She was simply present in her broken state. The rancher, though usually steady and unflinching, felt a twinge of discomfort and concern. He knew that look, the look of someone who had carried more than their body could bear, who had walked miles through despair and had nothing left to hide. And yet, there was also something unreadable, a shadow behind her eyes that hinted at stories she was not ready to tell. The woman took another step forward, pressing her fingers against the doorframe, as if testing whether the world outside was real or some cruel extension of the isolation she had endured. She shivered, whether from cold or from lingering fear, it was impossible to tell. She muttered to herself again, almost inaudibly, "I'm filthy." Inside and out, repeating the confession as though saying it aloud might cleanse it or perhaps make it permanent. Her voice carried the weight of a soul that had been worn down by unseen forces, by experiences that had left her raw and trembling. There was an undeniable fragility in her posture, but beneath it, a stubborn streak of survival burned quietly. She had come this far, walked this long, and despite the grime, the exhaustion, and the evident pain, she had not given up. Her presence demanded recognition, not pity, and she seemed to know instinctively that the rancher's stoic, solitary, a man who had built walls around himself, might be the only one willing to see her without judgment. And so she waited, shivering on the porch, the wind tugging at her torn clothing, eyes scanning the dim interior of the cabin, hoping that the next moment would bring warmth, shelter, and perhaps a fleeting sense of safety. The ranch sprawled across acres of uneven land, bordered by dense woods that swallowed the horizon. Under the moonlight, the fields looked silver and haunted, as if they held secrets in the rustling grass. The main cabin, a massive structure of weathered timber and iron hinges, stood like a sentinel against the darkness, its silhouette cutting sharply against the night sky. A faint glow from lanterns inside hinted at life, but the shadows clinging to the corners of the property suggested that not everything was as safe as it seemed. Fences, some leaning and broken, marked the boundaries of the ranch. Old equipment lay scattered across the yard, a rusting plow, a wheelbarrow with a bent handle, a trough half filled with murky water. Everything had the patina of long neglect, though the caretaker had clearly been here, moving among the chaos like a silent warden. The ranch was alive in its own quiet way, the low moans of the wind through hollow beams, the creak of a loose sign swinging, the distant clatter of a trapped animal or unseen creature, all of it combining into a symphony of isolation. The cabin itself was deceptively simple. From the outside, it appeared like any ordinary rural dwelling, but the scale of it was unusual. The door was taller and wider than standard, built to accommodate someone of unusual stature. Windows, small and irregular, let in just enough light to cast slanted patterns across the floor. Inside, shadows danced along the walls, thrown by the flickering glow of lanterns and a crackling fireplace. Every surface bore marks of years of labor, scratches on the wood from tools, patches of worn stone in the hearth, and the faint aroma of leather, wood smoke, and earth. It was a place that had seen countless seasons, each one leaving its marked dot. The giant rancher moved through this space with a sense of ownership and comfort that only comes from a life spent in rhythm with the land. His steps, though large and heavy, were measured and careful, each one sounding authority and familiarity. Tools hung from hooks, ropes were coiled neatly, and stacks of firewood leaned against the walls in precise order. Despite the ruggedness of the structure, there was a certain protection here, a fortress built not only to survive the elements but to withstand the chaos of the outside world. Yet, despite its solidity, the ranch held an aura of tension. The isolation was palpable. The surrounding woods seemed to watch, to hold their breath, waiting for intruders or misfortune. Small details made the place feel alive. A rocking chair swayed gently on its own, though no one sat in it. A floorboard groaned under its own weight, echoing through the cavernous space. Shadows gathered and receded as if breathing with the house itself. The rancher's presence grounded the environment, but even he was not immune to the subtle unease that seemed to seep from the earth, the trees, and the air itself. Outside, the land stretched toward the horizon in waves of tall grass and scattered wildflowers, blending into patches of mud and exposed soil. Paths carved through the fields spoke of animals, human movement, and hidden tracks that led into the woods. A wind chime, hanging near the barn, clinked softly in the breeze, producing a sound both melodic and mournful. The ranch's isolation was both its charm and its curse, a sanctuary for those who respected its solitude, a trap for anyone unprepared for its quiet, relentless scrutiny. The night seemed endless. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind, reminded the newcomer that she was far from the comforts of civilization. Even the stars, bright but distant, offered no guidance, only a cold reminder of the world beyond that was now unreachable. The rancher's figure, massive and steady, became a beacon of stability in this strange, lonely expanse. His presence suggested safety, yet the aura of tension in the air warned that this night might not unfold easily, that the ranch's walls might witness more than ordinary encounters. The woman lingered at the edge of the porch, shivering as her gaze swept across the yard, taking in the shadows, the uneven ground, and the looming woods. Each element seemed alive, mysterious, and dangerous. She sensed instinctively that this ranch was a world apart, governed by rules she could not yet understand. And yet, in the solidity of the cabin, in the quiet command of its caretaker, she felt a tentative glimmer of hope, that perhaps here she could find temporary shelter from the storm inside her. The ranch was more than a setting. It was a character, silent yet omnipresent, observing every motion, every thought, every fear. It was a place of labor and isolation, of protection and latent menace, a crucible in which secrets and revelations would inevitably collide. The cabin door creaked as the rancher finally opened it, revealing the glow of a single lantern and the massive silhouette of a man shaped by years of labor. His presence was imposing, broad-shouldered, with hands calloused from rope, tools, and long days under the sun, but his eyes, sharp and attentive, softened when they landed on her. He had seen hardship etched on many faces over the years, but few carried the kind of raw vulnerability she radiated. "Evening," he said, his voice deep, steady, and surprisingly calm, as though he had been expecting trouble and prepared for it. In the same breath, "You lost?" She shook her head, though her movements were small, almost tentative. I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. She stepped closer to the threshold, glancing at the warm interior of the cabin, then back at the darkness beyond. Her clothes clung to her in grimy patches. Her hair fell in tangled strands around her face, and she shivered despite the warmth of the lantern light. "I'm filthy." "Inside and out," she repeated, the words heavy with self-loathing and exhaustion. The rancher's brow furrowed. He didn't flinch at the sight of her. Instead, he studied her carefully, noting the dirt under her nails, the small scratches on her arms, and the hollowness in her eyes. Something about her made him pause an intangible weight, like she carried more than mere physical grime. "Inside and out, huh?" he said cautiously, his tone neutral but probing. "That's a lot to carry." She lowered her gaze, hugging herself tightly, as if trying to hold together fragments of herself that threatened to scatter in the wind. I've been walking for a long time," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't know where else to go. I need—" She trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence, unsure if she even wanted to. The rancher stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. His movements were deliberate, measured, signaling both caution and invitation. "All right," he said. "Come inside. You can warm up, rest. We'll see from there." She hesitated, one foot on the threshold, the other still in the cold night. Something about the cabin, the man, the quiet authority he exuded, made her instincts tangle with both relief and suspicion. Yet the chill gnawed at her, and the promise of shelter, however temporary, proved too compelling to resist. Slowly, she stepped inside, her shoulders hunched, as if expecting the floorboards themselves to judge her presence. The interior smelled of smoke, leather, and the faint tang of earth, comforting in its simplicity, grounding in its honesty. The rancher moved toward the fireplace, stoking the embers with ease, the sudden warmth radiating across the room. Shadows flickered against the walls, elongating her silhouette and reflecting the tension between them. The silence that settled after she entered was heavy, filled with unspoken questions. "Name?" he asked finally, breaking the silence. His tone was direct, almost businesslike, but carried the subtle curiosity of someone who had long ago learned. That appearances rarely told the whole story. She hesitated, then muttered, "Elara." A faint tremor betrayed her nervousness. "Elara," he repeated, as though testing the sound of it in the air. "You've been far from home?" "Yes." "Very far," she whispered, her eyes drifting to the floorboards, avoiding his gaze. There was a hint of fear, but also a quiet strength beneath it, the strength of someone who had endured much but was still here, still moving forward. The rancher nodded, silently acknowledging both her admission and her courage. He didn't push for details, sensing that the story she carried was not one to be rushed. Instead, he moved to a cabinet, retrieving a folded blanket. "Here," he said, holding it out. "Wrap yourself up. You'll feel better after a bit." Of warmth. Her eyes widened slightly at the gesture, caught between gratitude and suspicion. She accepted the blanket with trembling hands, pulling it close as though it might shield her not just from the cold, but from everything that had followed her here. The rancher watched her, quiet and steady, noting the way her fingers clutched the fabric, how her shoulders slowly lost some of their tension. Even in silence, the interaction was rich with meaning, a fragile truce between the vulnerabilities she carried and the protective instincts he couldn't ignore. Outside, the wind continued to whisper through the gaps in the cabin, rustling the trees and carrying the night's chill. Inside, however, the lantern's glow and the slow crackle of fire provided a fragile sanctuary, a pause between the terror of the journey and whatever awaited them next. The rancher held the blanket out to her with a steady, almost ritualistic motion, the lantern light catching the fibers in a soft glow. He was careful not to reach too close, giving her space, understanding that the last thing she needed was to feel crowded or threatened. She hesitated, a flicker of doubt crossing her eyes as she studied him. There was something about his size, his presence broad, unyielding, that made her instinctively wary. Yet beneath that imposing exterior, there was a gentleness, a quiet patience, that reassured her enough to reach forward. Her hands trembled as she touched the blanket. The fabric was rougher than she expected, homespun and slightly coarse, yet warm from being near the fire. She wrapped it around her shoulders, the edges brushing her arms, and drew it tightly across her chest. For the first time in hours, maybe days, she felt the comforting weight of something that wasn't trying to hurt her. The warmth seeped through her clothes, chasing away the chill of the night, but it couldn't reach the deeper cold that clung to her bones. The rancher watched her carefully. There was a tension in the room, a quiet anticipation, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. He had seen many travelers over the years, people seeking refuge from storms, wild animals, or life itself. Yet something about her unsettled him, an intangible presence, a shadow behind her eyes, a hint that the trouble she carried was far from ordinary. "Better?" he asked, his voice low and steady, almost more a statement than a question. Elara nodded, though faintly. She adjusted the blanket, tucking it around her more securely. Her gaze flicked to the floorboards, then to the walls, taking in the room's quiet order, tools neatly hung, firewood stacked with precision, the faint scent of smoke still lingering in the air. It was domestic, grounding, and yet something about the space felt unusual. Not menacing, exactly, but expectant, as if the house knew more than it let on. She shifted slightly under the weight of the blanket, and a quiet sigh escaped her lips. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was soft, hesitant, yet carrying a faint note of relief. It was not just the warmth she appreciated. It was the gesture itself, the acknowledgement that she had arrived somewhere that allowed her to exist. Without scrutiny, without immediate judgment, the rancher remained silent, observing her with a careful, measured gaze. He wanted to give her time, space, but he also sensed that the moment was delicate, a thin veneer of safety that could easily shatter. He had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. People carried secrets, some harmless, some dangerous, and it was rarely possible to discern which was which until the right or wrong moment arrived. Alara hugged the blanket tighter, and in doing so, she seemed to shrink further into herself. The movement was almost involuntary, protective, as if the fabric itself were a shield not only against the cold but against the world she had fled. Her fingers gripped the edges, knuckles white, a silent indicator of tension, fear, and weariness. She muttered under her breath, almost to herself, "I'm filthy," inside and out. The repetition of the confession carried a strange weight, almost like a mantra, a plea for absolution or recognition. The rancher's eyes narrowed slightly. The words were unusual, not just in their phrasing, but in the resonance behind them. They seemed to hint at more than dirt and exhaustion. He could not yet place it, but he felt a prickling at the base of his neck, an instinctive warning that something in her presence was different. He finally stepped back, giving her more room on the floor by the hearth where the flames cast long, flickering shadows. The blanket glowed faintly in the light, and for a brief moment the room seemed to hold a fragile calm, a pause between the turmoil of her arrival and whatever lay ahead. The silence was thick, heavy with anticipation, but there was also a tentative sense of safety, a fragile equilibrium between two people who had never met before, yet whose lives were about to intertwine in ways neither could fully predict. And then, almost imperceptibly, she shifted the blanket in a way that revealed something, just a hint, that would soon shatter that delicate balance, drawing the rancher closer to a discovery he could never have imagined. Alara shifted under the blanket, her movements hesitant, as though she feared the very act of being seen. The warmth of the fire failed to chase away the chill that clung to her, and the rancher noticed it immediately. There was something in her posture, a subtle tension, that made him instinctively step closer, but not too close. He had learned long ago that some wounds were not visible, and some dangers came dressed in vulnerability. She began, her voice barely above. A whisper, trailing off as if she weren't certain she wanted to continue. Her hands gripped the edges of the blanket, tugging it tighter around her body. "It's not just dirt. It's more than that. She swallowed hard, and for a moment her gaze flicked toward the fire, then back to him. The hesitation in her eyes was almost painful to watch. The rancher tilted his head, sensing the gravity behind her words. "More than dirt?" he asked slowly, trying to keep his tone neutral. His curiosity was tempered with caution. He had dealt with fear, desperation, and grief countless times in his life, but something about the way she spoke, the rhythm of her voice, the weight of her pauses, suggested a secret that was heavier than any normal burden. "Yes," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "I've been hiding from people. From things." She shivered, not entirely from the cold. The blanket slipped slightly, revealing a small, jagged scar along her forearm, raw against the pale skin. The rancher's eyes followed it, but he did not comment. He had learned that some things needed time to be revealed fully. There was Mpatbur's intensity in her gaze now, a mixture of fear, shame, and a desperate plea for understanding. "I don't want you to be afraid," she whispered. The words barely carried over the crackle of the fire, but they seemed to hang in the air, charged with unspoken meaning. Her hands tightened on the blanket, and her body seemed to fold inward, as if trying to disappear entirely under its folds. The rancher remained still, his presence steady, grounding. "Afraid of what?" he asked cautiously, aware that the answer could change everything in this room. In this night, Elara hesitated, biting her lip as if debating whether to speak or retreat into silence. "Of me," she finally said, the words trembling in the air. "Of what I've become, what I carry. I've tried to hide it, keep it from hurting anyone, but it's here. It's inside me, and I can't always control it." Her admission sent a ripple of unease through the rancher. He had expected stories of hardship, exhaustion, even tragedy, but not this. Not the palpable sense of something deeper, something almost unnatural lurking beneath the surface. His instincts told him to remain calm, to wait, to let her show him what she truly carried. But a cold awareness settled over him. Whatever she was, it was unlike anything he had encountered before. Elara's eyes darted to the floor, then back to his, her pupils wide, reflecting both fear and a spark of something indefinable. "I didn't want you to see it like this," she admitted. "I've never let anyone see it, not like this." The blanket shifted again, small hints of movement beneath it suggesting she was holding something hidden, something that had survived. Her flight, her suffering, her desperate journey to this remote place. The rancher's breath caught slightly. His muscles tensed instinctively, yet he did not move. Something about her, the way she feared judgment, the fragility in her posture, and the weight of the confession demanded patience. He could sense the moment approaching, the instant when the secret she carried would confront him fully. And, in that instant, everything would change. Elara shivered again, this time not from the cold, and the rancher noticed the flicker of dread in her eyes. She tightened the blanket one last time, her fingers trembling, as if preparing herself for the inevitable moment of exposure. The room felt charged, the firelight casting long, twisting shadows on the walls, echoing the tension that now hung between them. "You need to know?" she whispered finally, almost to herself, "because hiding it doesn't make it go away." The rancher's hands, massive and steady, hovered near the edge of the blanket. He did not pull it back yet, waiting, knowing instinctively that the reveal would come on her terms. And when it did, it would shatter the fragile sense of calm that had settled in the room, replacing it with shock, disbelief, and an undeniable confrontation with something neither of them could ignore. The pause stretched, thick and heavy, until the fire itself seemed to hold its breath. And then, the movement beneath the blanket suggested that the moment of revelation was imminent. The moment that would change everything in this isolated cabin on the edge of the night. The rancher's massive hands hovered just above the blanket, his knuckles white from the tension. He had seen scars, injuries, and even strange wounds over the years, but nothing had prepared him for the sense of dread that now coiled tightly in his chest. Elara's trembling hands clutched the blanket like a lifeline, and her eyes dark, haunted, wide with fear, pleaded silently, begging for understanding even as they warned of what was about to be revealed. "Okay," he said finally, his voice low and steady, more to anchor himself than to comfort her. "Show me." The words were barely out of his mouth when she exhaled sharply and slowly began to pull the blanket aside. The motion was deliberate, almost ritualistic, each inch revealing more of her body, but not in the way he had expected. At first, it was just the pale skin of her arms and shoulders, flecked with dirt and dried sweat. Then came the subtle, unnatural textures, patches of skin that seemed almost translucent, veins faintly glowing beneath the surface, and a strange, undulating pattern across her torso. Like something alive just beneath the skin. The rancher froze. His breath caught in his throat. His eyes widened as the full extent of what she carried became horrifyingly apparent. Her body was marred in ways that no wound, no disease, no human affliction could account for. Sections of her skin shifted unnaturally, like it was not entirely flesh, like it was fused with something else, something grotesque, yet almost sentient. There was a subtle movement, a pulse beneath the surface, as if whatever haunted her had its own heartbeat, synchronized with hers yet separate. "What?" he stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence. His mind scrambled, trying to rationalize what he was seeing. He had been faced with danger, grief, and the harsh realities of life on the ranch, but this defied everything he knew. His instincts screamed to step back, to flee, yet something stronger, a need to understand, to not abandon her, kept him rooted in place. Ilara flinched at his reaction, her hands shaking violently now. I tried to hide it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't want anyone to see. I didn't want anyone to run." Her words carried fear, shame, and a desperate plea for acceptance. The weight of her confession pressed down on the room, mingling with the flickering shadows cast by the fire. The rancher's eyes darted over every inch of her revealed form, trying to find a foothold, a familiar marker that would allow him to process the impossible. But there was nothing conventional here, nothing that could be explained with logic or reason. He felt a cold sweat prickling at the back of his neck, the hair on his arms rising instinctively. The room, once warm and safe, now felt charged, almost alive with anticipation, like the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting to witness what would happen next. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice to remain calm. "Ilara, what are you?" The words trembled as they left him, betraying the shock he could not mask. "I don't know," she admitted, tears brimming in her eyes. I've carried this for as long as I can remember. I thought I could hide it, control it, but it's part of me now. I'm not like anyone else." She curled slightly inward, the blanket slipping further, revealing the subtle, writhing undulations across her back. It was as if her body itself was alive with a secret that defied comprehension, a presence that made the air feel thick and oppressive. The rancher's mind raced. He had seen suffering, had faced the harshness of life in ways most people never experienced. Yet the visceral strangeness of what stood before him left him stunned. Fear clashed with compassion in his chest, a duality he had rarely felt so intensely. He wanted to recoil, to deny what his eyes were telling him, but some part of him, the part that had welcomed her in despite the unknown, held fast. "All right," he said finally, voice firm but steady, though his heart raced in his chest. "Whatever. You're not alone. Not tonight. Not while you're here." Ilara's body trembled with relief and continued fear. She lowered the blanket slightly, the first shred of trust forming between them. The shocking revelation had come, but so had the fragile foundation of understanding and the knowledge that whatever horrors she carried, the night on the ranch would witness them fully, without immediate judgment or abandonment. The fire crackled. The shadows twisted, and the room seemed to pulse with the weight of the moment. Outside, the wind continued to howl through the trees, but inside, the impossible had been revealed. And now the next chapter, one of understanding, confrontation, and survival, would begin. The rancher stood frozen, the blanket hanging loosely between them, as if the room itself had conspired to hold him in place. His hands, massive and steady in the past, now twitched slightly, unsure whether to reach out or retreat. He could feel his heart hammering in his chest, a wild, irregular rhythm that mirrored the subtle, undulating movements on Ilara's body. Rational thought struggled to assert itself against the primal surge of disbelief and fear. What is this?" he finally whispered, almost to himself. The words trembled, carried with them a weight of disbelief that made them sound foreign, even to his own ears. His eyes darted around the room, searching for any explanation, a trick of the light, a reflection, a shadow, but the flickering fire confirmed what his senses were already screaming. This was real. Ilara flinched at his tone, bracing herself as though expecting him to react violently. I didn't want anyone to see, she whispered, her voice breaking. I can't control it all the time. I've tried, but the rancher's breath caught. He wanted to look away, to deny what he had seen, but the enormity of it pinned him in place. The air in the cabin seemed heavier now, charged with the weight of the impossible. Every flicker of the fire threw distorted shadows across her form, making the undulations beneath her skin appear even more alive, as though some unseen presence pulsed within her. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. The rancher's mind raced, cataloging every instinctive reaction he had learned over decades on the ranch. He had faced storms, wild animals, and desperate strangers, yet nothing had ever prepared him for this. Fear clawed at him, primal and raw, urging him to retreat to the safety of the known. But beneath it, something stronger anchored him, a deep, unshakable sense that despite appearances, Ilara was not just a threat. She was in need, fragile and desperate, carrying a weight that went far beyond the surface horror. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to take a step forward, then another. The sound of his boots on the worn floorboards echoed, each one a tentative claim on stability in a room that felt anything but stable. "All right," he said slowly, voice gruff but steady. I don't understand it, but you're here. Now you're safe here, for tonight at least." Ilara's trembling eased slightly, though her eyes never left his. There was a cautious hope flickering behind her fear, a fragile acknowledgement that someone had accepted her in spite of the impossible revelation. The blanket slipped further from her shoulders as she loosened her grip, exposing more of the strange patterns across her skin, yet she didn't recoil. She was testing the limits of trust, waiting to see if the rancher would falter or remain. He remained still, though inside his mind churned. His hands itched to reach out, to help, but he was uncertain how to act in the face of something so alien. His rational mind told him to observe, to proceed with caution. His instincts, honed by years of survival, urged him to protect not just himself, but her. The duality of fear and compassion warred within him, creating a tension so palpable that the cabin seemed to hold its breath alongside him. Outside, the wind rattled the eaves, sharp and insistent, as if echoing the turmoil inside. The shadows danced across the walls, stretching and contorting in ways that mirrored the rancher's conflicted mind. He realized with a jolt that the night had shifted. What had begun as a chance encounter had become something far deeper, something that challenged the very boundaries of understanding. Ilara's voice cut through the thick tension, quiet but firm. "I'm sorry. I didn't want to frighten you." The rancher's throat tightened. Fear still lingered, but it was tempered now by a grim determination. "You don't have to apologize," he said, finally exhaling a long, controlled breath. "I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure this out together." The words, though simple, carried weight. They were a promise, a declaration that the shock, the horror, and the uncertainty of what had been revealed would not dictate the night alone. The cabin, with its flickering fire and oppressive shadows, seemed to settle slightly, as though acknowledging a fragile truce. Yet the tension lingered, electric, palpable, a reminder that the revelation was only the beginning. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and inside, the rancher and Ilara remained locked in a fragile, uneasy understanding. The night was far from over, and whatever secrets Ilara carried were still alive beneath the surface, waiting. The fire crackled between them, filling the cabin with intermittent warmth and casting flickering shadows that danced across the walls. Ilara hugged the blanket closer, her fingers gripping the edges like a lifeline. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Words seemed inadequate, fragile against the enormity of what had just been revealed. Finally, she drew a shaky breath and lifted her gaze to meet the rancher's. It started a long time ago, she began, her voice low and hesitant, carrying the weight of years she had tried to bury. I was different even then. Not like the other kids, not like anyone. At first, it was small things I couldn't explain. Shadows that moved when no one was there. Voices that whispered when I was alone. I thought it was my imagination. Her eyes flickered toward the corner of the cabin, as if half expecting the shadows to respond. The rancher listened silently, his massive frame tense but still, giving her space while holding steady. He could sense the truth behind her words, the kind of truth that cuts deeper than physical wounds. Then, she continued, it grew. The skin, the patterns, they weren't always visible, but I felt them, crawling under my skin, moving. When I couldn't see, I tried to hide it, to cover it up, to act normal. But it wasn't just on the outside. It got inside too, my thoughts, my emotions, the things I felt, the things I thought. They twisted and grew until I couldn't control them anymore. That's why I said I'm filthy, inside and out. Because it's not just the dirt or the scratches or the scars. It's this thing that's a part of me now. And no matter what I do, I can't separate it from who I am. The rancher's eyes never left her, though his mind was racing. He had seen people broken by life, shaped by hardship, haunted by trauma, but this was something different, something almost beyond comprehension. Yet in her voice he heard honesty, a raw and unfiltered account of suffering. He felt an instinctive pull and need to anchor her in this moment, to prove that despite the horrors she carried, she wasn't entirely alone. I've run, she admitted, pulling the blanket tighter as if to shield herself from the memory. I've run from people, from towns, from anyone who might see me and react the way most people do. Fear, repulsion, hatred. I've learned to stay in the shadows, to keep moving, to survive by never being fully seen, but it's exhausting, and I can't keep running forever. Her voice trembled, laden with exhaustion, shame, and a deep, aching loneliness. The rancher swallowed, struggling to find words that would not betray his own unease. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough but steady. Hilara, whatever this is, whatever you've carried, you made it here. You're here now. That counts for something. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, though she didn't let them fall. It counts for something? She repeated, a faint note of disbelief in her tone. I've been trying to survive, yes. But I've been running from myself too. From everything I've become. I thought I would be alone forever. You're not alone, the rancher said firmly, though his words felt almost too simple for the gravity of the moment. Not tonight, not while you're here. And we'll figure out what comes next together. Hilara exhaled slowly, a shaky but genuine relief washing over her. For the first time in a long while, she felt the beginnings of trust, fragile, tentative, but undeniable. The blanket shifted slightly as she loosened her grip, revealing more of the subtle, writhing patterns beneath her skin, yet she did not recoil. She had spoken her truth, exposed her fears, and in doing so, had begun to bridge the gap between isolation and connection. The rancher leaned back slightly, taking in her story, the contours of her form, the palpable weight of years spent hiding and running. He realized that the challenge ahead was not just understanding the physical manifestation of her condition, but understanding her, the person who had endured so much and survived. The night stretched on, heavy with unspoken questions and possibilities, but now, beneath the fear and the shock, there was a fragile foundation. For the first time in hours, the cabin felt less like a place of confrontation and more like a sanctuary, temporary haven in which the impossible could exist without immediate judgment. And though neither of them could yet know what the morning would bring, for this moment there was understanding, however tentative, and a shared recognition that the night was not theirs to face alone. The room was silent except for the fire's crackle, each pop and hiss punctuating the tension that hung thickly in the cabin. The rancher's eyes never left Alara, and for the first time, he allowed himself to consider the enormity of the choice before him. He could feel it like a weight pressing on his chest, the choice to stay neutral, to retreat into the safety of ignorance, or to step forward into something uncertain, frightening, and profoundly human. Alara's trembling hands gripped the blanket. Though the worst of her fear had passed with her confession, her gaze was fixed on him, waiting, reading him as if she could sense every thought churning behind his calm exterior. The patterns under her skin shifting, writhing, undeniably unnatural remained. Visible, yet they no longer carried the terror of the initial reveal. Now they were simply a part of her, a burden she bore, a truth she had finally admitted aloud. The rancher's jaw tightened. He thought of the life he had led, years of solitude, days filled with toil, nights consumed by the silence of the ranch and the wind through the trees. He had faced storms, wild animals, and desperate strangers before. He had seen cruelty, suffering, and grief in forms both mundane and unimaginable. And yet, nothing had tested him like this moment. The decision to accept someone wholly filth, fear, and allured to turn away and preserve his own comfort. "I won't lie," he said finally, his voice low, steady, and deliberate. This is more than I can understand. And I can't promise I'll ever fully understand it." He paused, taking a deep breath. "But I do know this. You came here, you're here, and you're asking for help. That alone, trusting someone with this, it matters. And I can't ignore that." Ilara's eyes widened, glimmering with a mixture of hope and disbelief. You mean that?" she whispered. "Even after seeing me like this?" "Yes," he said firmly. "Even after seeing you like this, the world out there, it would turn its back. But not me. Not tonight. You're not alone here, Ilara. You choose to stay. I'll choose to protect you, to help you. That's my choice." The words hung between them, a fragile promise in a room heavy with fear and wonder. Ilara's lips trembled, and she swallowed hard, tears welling but not yet falling. She had carried so much for so long: shame, fear, the constant need to hide, and now, for the first time, someone had made a conscious choice to accept her entirely. But the rancher wasn't naive. He knew the implications of his decision. Her condition, whatever it truly was, could bring danger, not just to him but to the ranch, the land, perhaps even the fragile order of his life. It would test his limits, challenge his understanding of reality, and push him to confront things he might never be prepared for. Yet, despite the risk, despite the fear, he felt something undeniable, a moral imperative to act, to choose humanity over convenience, compassion over safety. He extended a hand, not out of dominance, but as a gesture of solidarity. "You stay here tonight. We'll figure it out tomorrow, the day after, as long as it takes. Whatever this is, we face it together. You don't have to run anymore." Ilara's trembling eased, replaced by a tentative, fragile relief. She took his hand, the connection grounding her in the moment. The blanket slipped slightly from her shoulders, revealing the strange, undulating patterns beneath, yet she longer recoiled. She had chosen to trust, and he had chosen to accept that trust, however uncertain the consequences. Outside, the wind whispered against the cabin, insistent and restless, but inside, the room felt different. The weight of revelation and shock lingered, yet it was tempered now by conscious choice, by an act of moral courage. The night would not be easy, the days ahead uncertain and fraught, but in that instant, two people, one terrified and burdened, the other cautious but steadfast, had made a pact that transcended fear. The rancher leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly. "We'll face this," he said, voice quiet but firm, step by step. Elara nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible smile breaking through her exhaustion. For the first time in a long while, she felt a fragment of safety, a shard of hope. The choice had been made, and though the night was far from over, it had shifted irrevocably. She would no longer face her horrors alone. And he had committed himself to confronting the unknown alongside her. The fire crackled, the shadows danced, and the night stretched on, charged with tension, fraught with possibility, but tempered now by the conscious, brave act of choice. Fire crackled in uneven bursts, sending flickering light across the walls of the cabin. Shadows stretched and recoiled with every pop, almost as if the room itself were watching, alive with quiet anticipation. Outside, the wind whispered insistently through the trees, rattling the eaves and carrying with it a cold, restless energy. Inside, the rancher and Elara sat opposite each other, the blanket pooled around her shoulders, both of them aware that the night had shifted irreversibly. The rancher's eyes studied her, tracing the subtle, undulating patterns beneath her skin. The thing she carried so visibly now. He had made his choice, a conscious, deliberate commitment to stand by her, but the enormity of that choice pressed against him like a weight. He knew the night would not end with safety alone. The days ahead could bring danger, confrontation, or consequences beyond their understanding. Yet he felt an unfamiliar clarity. Whatever came, he would face it, step by step, with her at his side. Elara exhaled slowly, her body still trembling but her shoulders relaxing slightly. For the first time in a long while, she felt the beginnings of trust, not just in him, but in herself. She had been running for so long, hiding both the filth of her body and the turmoil within. And now, for the first time, she was allowed to exist in the open, without judgment. The cabin, the fire, even the oppressive shadows, all felt different, less threatening, more like a sanctuary carved out in the midst of chaos. Yet the night was far from simple. From somewhere deep in the woods, a low, almost mournful howl carried through the air. It was a reminder that the world beyond the cabin remained unpredictable, untamed, and perhaps dangerous. The wind picked up, rattling the loose boards of the porch, and for a moment, the firelight seemed to dance more erratically, throwing grotesque shapes across the walls. The strange patterns beneath Elara's skin shifted subtly, almost as if responding to the pulse of the storm outside. The rancher rose slowly, moving to the window. He peered into the darkness, the expanse of the fields and the edge of the forest pressing in. He knew the night could bring more than just wind or wild animals. The revelation they had shared was not a secret the world would leave untouched, and he sensed that whatever lay outside might soon intersect with the fragile sanctuary they had created inside. "Elara," he said, his voice low but steady, "whatever comes, we face it together, not just tonight. When morning comes and the world wakes, we face it, whatever it is, side by side." She nodded, her eyes glinting with quiet resolve. She had no illusions about the dangers ahead, nor about the impossibility of fully understanding what she carried. But the knowledge that someone had chosen to stand with her steadfast and unwavering gave her the courage to endure, to confront, to survive. For a moment, silence enveloped them, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the wind's distant howl. Then, almost imperceptibly, the patterns beneath Elara's skin shifted again, more pronounced this time, subtle motions that suggested awareness, intelligence, or perhaps anticipation. The rancher noticed it, the familiar twinge of unease returning, yet tempered by his determination. He didn't flinch. The cabin seemed to breathe with him, a living witness to the fragile alliance forged in shock, fear, and trust. The night would not be easy. The world beyond the walls was unpredictable, and possibly hostile. But within this small space, at least for now, two people, one burdened by impossible truths, the other by the weight of choice, had claimed a fragile victory. They were together, facing the unknown. The wind howled louder, almost insistently, carrying with it the promise of challenges yet to come. Outside, the shadows stretched longer, and the field seemed to whisper secrets the fire could not illuminate. Inside, the fire continued to flicker, illuminating Alara's strange living patterns and the steadfast figure of the rancher. Neither moved to cover the truth now. They had accepted it, and in doing so, had embraced the uncertain night ahead. And as the fire sputtered, throwing one final flickering shadow across the room, the story hung in delicate suspense. The night waited, infinite and dark, for what would come next. The revelation had been made, the choice had been taken, and now only time could reveal whether their fragile alliance would survive the storm both within and without. The cabin settled into a tense quiet, alive with anticipation as the wind carried its distant warnings across the empty fields. Whatever horrors or mysteries the dawn would bring, one truth remained. For the first time in a long while, Alara would not face them alone.